From the storm-tossed shores and frozen fjords of Scandinavia, a new age of terror was unleashed upon the world. They were the Northmen, the Vikings, a force of nature whose dragon-headed longships sliced through the waves, bringing fire and steel to the coasts of Europe. For centuries, their name was a whisper of fear, synonymous with brutal raids and merciless slaughter. Yet, this is not merely a story of savage plunder. It is the epic saga of how these pagan seafarers evolved into pious crusaders, how raiders became kings, and how their ambition and adaptability would not only carve out new kingdoms from Britain to Sicily, but ultimately lay the very foundations of medieval Europe. This is the story of the Norman fury born from Viking blood. For Europe, the Age of Calamities began on the 8th of June in the year 793. On that day, fearsome warriors from the north descended upon the island of Lindisfarne, situated off the east coast of England. Their target was the monastery of St. Cuthbert, a place of great wealth and sanctity. They plundered its treasures, slaughtered most of the monks who stood in their way, and dragged the survivors away in chains, destined to be sold as slaves. For devout Christians across the continent, this assault was utterly shocking and unprecedented. It was a violation of the most sacred of places, a brutal introduction to a new and terrifying enemy. In the aftermath of the raid, the scholar Alcuin of York wrote with horror and disbelief, declaring that such an atrocity had never before been witnessed in Britain. He lamented that the house of God was spattered with the blood of its priests, and that the holiest of sites had been despoiled by heathen men. For the Christian world, this was a terrifying omen, a sign of divine wrath. However, no one could have imagined that this gruesome event was not an isolated incident, but merely the beginning. In the years that followed, the attacks would continue, growing in scale and ferocity, proving to be far more relentless than anyone could have ever conceived. The key to the Vikings' success was speed. Their terrifying dragon-headed longships, marvels of Scandinavian engineering, seemed to appear and disappear like ghosts on the great rivers of Europe. These relentless warriors from the north were like specters, bringing death, blood, and devastation wherever they went, leaving behind cities and towns that were little more than smoldering ruins, obscured by clouds of black smoke. They strategically chose vulnerable areas, regions where enemy soldiers were scarce. Their shallow draft vessels allowed them to approach coastlines without the need for a harbor, enabling them to quickly assess whether an area was suitable for a swift raid. This calculated approach was devastatingly effective. Fortified towns with watchtowers or strong patrols were simply bypassed. In contrast, undefended lands with wealthy monasteries were ideal for plunder and destruction. The Vikings knew well that the monks possessed no weapons to defend themselves. This tactic allowed them to acquire vast amounts of loot while suffering minimal casualties. This hit-and-run strategy, known in Old Norse as strandhugg, was the preferred method for the groups that terrorized northwestern Europe until the 850s. But from that point forward, the nature of Viking attacks began to change, evolving into something far more ambitious. The small bands of raiders in a few ships soon transformed into massive invasion armies, commanded by kings or powerful jarls. By the 880s, large swaths of England had fallen under Viking control, a testament to their growing organization and ambition. In France, the famous Viking leader Rollo was, by the proposal of the Frankish King Charles the Simple himself, granted the lands that would become Normandy in the year 911. Though their enemies depicted them as merciless, savage barbarians, they were not invincible warriors. On the battlefield, it was often difficult to distinguish them from their Frankish or Anglo-Saxon opponents, as they wielded similar weapons and employed comparable tactics. One of their most essential tactics was the shield wall, a formation that was a staple of warfare during the Viking Age. This was not a particularly complex maneuver, and had been used since antiquity by Greeks, Persians, and later the Romans. The front ranks of the wall were composed of elite warriors, the Huskarls and Thengs, whose armor and shields were of superior quality. The ranks behind them provided support by pushing forward, reinforcing the front line, and quickly filling any gaps left by fallen comrades. Maintaining the integrity of the shield wall was of paramount importance for both sides in a battle. If the wall held, a defeated army could retreat in an orderly fashion with relatively few losses. However, If the shield wall collapsed, it signified a complete rout, a desperate scenario where it was every man for himself. But the true secret to the Vikings' military success was their unparalleled mobility. They almost always preferred to take the offensive rather than remain in a defensive position. This aggressive strategy gave them a significant advantage in raiding undefended commercial centers or monasteries. By the time local forces could be gathered to launch a counterattack, the northern warriors had already vanished with their plunder. This tactic created a strategic dilemma for their opponents. Mustering forces from one area inevitably left other regions vulnerable, opening up new opportunities for the Vikings to strike and secure even more loot. In the early Viking Age, particularly in Britain and France, the recorded raids were characterized by their lack of centralized command. Chroniclers describe the northern warriors as swarms of bees, scattering in all directions as if blown by the wind. Modern historians attribute this chaotic style of warfare to the absence of a unifying leader in the early 800s. Yet, their inherent ferocity and an insatiable lust for exploration gave them a distinct edge over their enemies. The bloody spectacle of their attacks and the way they reduced villages and towns to ashes created a terrifying image of the Viking in the minds of the people of Europe. This reputation alone was a powerful weapon. At times, the sheer terror inspired by these merciless warriors made it impossible to even assemble an army to confront them. Central to this legend were the berserkers, warriors described in Frankish and Anglo-Saxon records as having superhuman qualities. Their fearsome tales were told from the North Sea to the Atlantic coasts. It was believed that these fighters were blessed by the Norse god Odin, granting them an extraordinary resistance to wounds in battle. Modern historical analysis suggests that these warriors entered a trance-like state in the heat of battle, characterized by sudden bursts of rage and uncontrollable violence, allowing them to fight without fear. Nevertheless, their ferocious performance in combat was enough to immortalize them in the Viking sagas as superhuman warriors whose legends were told for generations. The deep, dark forests with their thick-trunked trees and the sharp cliffs of the mountain slopes provided the perfect cover for Viking ambushes. From these concealed positions, they would prey on defenseless merchant caravans or ensnare enemy scouting parties, turning the landscape itself into a weapon. Throughout the Viking Age, large-scale pitched battles were not very common. In the period between the initial Lindisfarne raid in 793 and the year 836, the number of Viking ships involved in attacks on England typically ranged from 3 to 5. Historians estimate that even the great army that invaded England in 865 numbered only around 5,000 men. The Vikings held a pragmatic view of warfare. If there was no material gain to be had, there was no point in fighting. In such situations, peaceful resolutions were always more profitable. The annual land tax, known as the Danegeld, which was paid in exchange for peace, enhanced the prestige of Viking leaders, motivated their soldiers, and attracted new warriors to their cause. Naval battles were also quite rare during the Viking Age. The ships of this era were not designed to stay at sea long enough to patrol and locate enemy fleets. When sea battles did occur, it was usually because one fleet had managed to trap another in a port or an estuary. However, the design of their ships, built from the sturdy trunks of oak trees, gave the Vikings numerous advantages. Their long, narrow, and flexible structure allowed them to cover distances quickly. Furthermore, they did not require a harbor and could land on any ordinary beach, granting them unparalleled access to inland territories. Throughout the Viking Age, rivers like the Elbe, Seine, Loire, and Thames served as highways for the northern warriors, allowing them to penetrate deep into continental Europe and Britain to raid the cities there. The best preserved example of a Viking ship from this period was unearthed during an excavation in Gokstad, Norway, in 1880. The Gokstad ship is a classic Viking Age vessel, approximately 28 meters long and 5 meters wide. It was equipped with a 110 square meter square sail that enabled it to reach speeds of up to 22 kilometers per hour. Constructed from strong oak, it was built to carry a crew of at least 40 to 70 men. Dendrochronological dating indicates the ship was built around the year 890, during what can be described as the zenith of Scandinavian expansion. As commercial activities became more widespread, a cargo section was added to the lower part of this type of ship, and the hull was enlarged. With these modifications towards the end of the Viking Age, their ships lost some of the speed and flexibility that had been their defining characteristics. The weapons used by Viking warriors varied depending on the region they came from and their economic status. Sagas written in the 12th century, along with records kept by the Anglo-Saxons and Franks, provide some information about the materials they used in battle. To gain a more complete understanding of Viking weaponry, one must look to archaeological data. Here, as in every society, we find inevitable differences based on social class. The swords produced in Viking Age Scandinavia were quite different from those used by medieval infantry and knights. They were practical, single-handed weapons that could be wielded with ease, making them ideal for sudden and fatal attacks. A groove, known as a fuller, running down the middle of the blade, provided balance and reduced its weight. However, due to their extreme cost, swords were not common among Viking warriors. Sometimes there was only a single sword per ship. For this reason, they favored another weapon that was just as practical and deadly as the sword, the axe. Many Viking graves dating to the 11th century are filled with axe heads, their wooden handles long since turned to dust. Axes became particularly widespread during the turbulent Vendel period in Scandinavia, a time marked by frequent warfare. A large portion of these were multi-purpose tools, used not only in battle but also in agriculture and shipbuilding. However, the Danes also possessed enormous 1.5-meter-long battle axes used exclusively for warfare. These were regarded as the most intimidating weapons of their era. The use of the spear during the Viking Age was at least as common as that of the axe. Its low cost, long reach and utility in hunting made the spear one of the most popular weapons among the Vikings. In addition to these, daggers, bows and arrows are also commonly found in Viking graves. Helmets and chainmail, however, were high cost, rarely used items that only the wealthiest Vikings could afford. But one piece of equipment was mandatory for every Viking warrior participating in a raid: a shield. Shields in the Viking Age were made from soft-wooded trees to be flexible and not shatter easily upon impact. These generally round shields were sometimes covered with leather to make them even more durable. Over the course of the Viking Age, the military organization of the Vikings underwent significant changes. In the period from the Lindisfarne raid in 793 to the 850s, Viking armies fought in a scattered and disorganized manner. However, particularly from the year 865, when the invasion of England began, Viking forces, gathering around famous Danish kings, started to act in a more organized fashion, both in Britain and on the continent. The primary reason for the Viking presence everywhere, from the Orkney Islands to the Strait of Gibraltar during these years, is seen as conflicts among the Scandinavian aristocratic class. According to this view, some of the defeated lords were forced to sail west in search of their destiny outside of Scandinavia. Their success abroad stemmed from their indifference to the rules invented by their enemies. Unlike the Anglo-Saxons, they did not schedule battle days and had no qualms about entering holy places with weapons. On the contrary, they looted defenseless churches and monasteries, and the clergy they captured were either sacrificed to their own gods or taken to Scandinavia to be sold in slave markets. They were seen by their enemies as fearless and merciless warriors. Yet, alongside the advantage provided by this terrifying image, Viking success was largely based on careful strategies, logistical planning, and their skill in both war and diplomacy. On the night of June 8th, the island of Lindisfarne, located on the eastern coast of the Kingdom of Northumbria, was attacked by fearsome warriors from the north. Their target was the monastery of St. Cuthbert, famous for its wealth. A large portion of the monks were slaughtered while trying to protect the holy relics. Some were taken as prisoners across the North Sea to Scandinavia, a land of ice and freezing cold. The northern warriors, who would later be called Vikings, had obtained immense plunder at Lindisfarne, but this was not enough for them. They would come back for more, and more plunder meant more blood and more destruction. Britain was on the eve of ruin. The Viking Age, as historians would later name it, had now begun. A year after the attack on Lindisfarne, the northern warriors attacked another wealthy monastery, this time in Jarrow. But here, their luck did not hold as it had before. Local forces captured and killed their leader. Those who managed to escape were caught in a relentless storm on their way back and were buried at the bottom of the North Sea. However, this was merely a warning for England. In the period leading up to 1830, the Viking attacks on various parts of the island were hit-and-run raids, known as strandhugg, carried out by a relatively small number of warriors. The number of Viking ships participating in these attacks usually ranged between 3 and 5 and never exceeded 10. But in the year 836, a Viking fleet that reached the north of England consisted of at least 25 ships. 2 years later, in 838, they were part of an alliance against King Egbert of Wessex, but they and their allies were defeated. Within a few years, the Viking raids began to change both in quantity and quality. However, the real change occurred in 850. In that year, the Vikings captured a fortification on the Isle of Thanet in the south of England and decided to settle there for the winter. This allowed them to extend their raiding activities into the autumn and to start their raids early the following spring. Within a few years, the region became even more active with the arrival of new Vikings. The sources speak of 350 ships seen around Kent. This was the largest Viking fleet ever seen in England up to that time. Accordingly, its impact was much greater than previous raids. Canterbury, one of England's important religious centres, was washed in blood, and the port of London was plundered. Still, the Vikings were not as organised as the Anglo-Saxons, nor did they know the island as well. In the same year, they were driven to a place called Aclea, and a large number of them were slaughtered. In the words of an English chronicler, this was the largest heathen army to have reached the island, but it would not be the last. In 865, the dragon-headed ships of the Vikings were sighted off the coast of East Anglia. Within a few days, the town of Thetford was teeming with thousands of Viking warriors. The local populace secured their peace by paying an annual land tax called the Danegeld. Anglo-Saxon sources referred to this massive force, led by Danish sea kings such as Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan, and Ubba, who held considerable popularity in their own lands as the Great Heathen Army. Indeed, the newcomers were unlike the raiding groups that had plagued the island in previous years. Their goal was far beyond mere plunder. This time their target was England itself. According to the Scandinavian sagas, this invasion was a campaign of vengeance. In Northumbria, the usurper King Ella had killed the legendary Viking king Ragnar Lothbrok by throwing him into a pit filled with vipers, but as the sagas tell, how the young boars would grunt if they knew the plight of the old boar. This grunting would ultimately become the beginning of a disaster for England. Soon, Ragnar's sons would avenge their father by making all of England bleed. In contrast, Anglo-Saxon sources explain the events in a more pragmatic light. In many records, Ivar, Halfdan, and Ubba, whose brotherhood is uncertain, are described as landless kings. By late 865, England stood on the brink of invasion. The great heathen army had settled in Thetford, within the kingdom of East Anglia. The weary locals, long tormented by Viking raids, knew they couldn't resist such a massive force. Instead, they chose diplomacy over destruction, offering the Vikings annual Danegeld payments and horses to aid their future conquests across England. Modern historians largely agree this was a pragmatic move by a kingdom too weak to fight, yet clever enough to survive the storm gathering on its shores. Thus, East Anglia managed to divert the Viking threat from its own lands, at least for a while. The first target of the Viking warriors, now filled with hatred and rage against King Ella, as the Scandinavian sagas express, was the kingdom of Northumbria. On November 21, 866, the city of York fell to the northern warriors without a single battle. King Ella understood the gravity of the situation. His first act was to form an alliance with the legitimate king, Osbert, with whom he was contending for the Northumbrian throne, and attack York. However, the troops under his command lacked the capability to defeat the Viking warriors. When the fighting ended, both Ella and Osbert lay lifeless on the battlefield. In contrast, the Scandinavian sagas embellished Ella's death with a terrifying yet poetic narrative. According to this account, Ella was sacrificed to Odin through a ritual execution method known among the Vikings as the blood eagle, by having his ribs cut and his lungs pulled out. Thus, the young boars had avenged the old boar who was killed in the viper pit. However, It would soon become clear that the matter was not just about simple revenge. After the defeat of Ella and Osbert, Northumbria fell under Viking control. A Danish kingdom was established in York, ruled by a puppet king loyal to the Vikings. Northumbria would remain under Scandinavian influence for the next 2 centuries, but the Vikings had no intention of staying there. They were determined to carry plunder, destruction, and violence to every corner of England. By 869, the rivers of blood and bone brought to life by Viking axes began to flow south. The armies under the leadership of Ivar and Ubba invaded the lands of East Anglia in that year. King Edmund was defeated near Hoxne and captured by the Vikings. In fact, Ivar and Ubba intended to establish a new kingdom here, ruled by a puppet king loyal to them, just as they had in York. They considered placing Edmund at the head of this kingdom, on the condition that he remain loyal to them. However, it was not possible to put this idea into practice. Edmund refused the offer made to him, and he paid a heavy price for it. The former East Anglian king turned the notoriously unstable Ivar, who struggled to control his bursts of rage, into a figure of pure fury, and ultimately Edmund had to face his own doom. Ivar had Edmund beaten with clubs and bound with iron chains. He then hung him from a tree and subjected him to a shower of arrows until there was no visible spot left on his body. When Ivar was finished, Edmund resembled a porcupine more than a man. After waiting for a while for Edmund to die, he cut off his head and threw it into the bushes. The kingdom he left behind fell under Viking control, and like Northumbria, East Anglia remained under Scandinavian influence for many years. However, there was still a powerful kingdom in England that could resist the Vikings. In the first days of 871, the armies of the Kingdom of Wessex, led by King Ethelred and his brother Alfred, inflicted a heavy defeat on the Viking forces commanded by Halfdan and Bagsec at Ashdown. Bagsec was brutally killed, and Halfdan barely escaped with a few of his men. But just at that moment, the arrival of a king named Guthrum from Scandinavia with reinforcements joined him, allowing the Viking army to winter in London in 871 and 872. However, trouble was brewing in the north. A rebellion initiated by the puppet king in the kingdom of Northumbria caused Halfdan and Guthrum's attention to shift there, but soon the Vikings managed to restore their former position. Following Ivar's death in 873, the great heathen army began to split into parts to plunder different regions of the country. The panic, fear, and terror experienced in these years left deep scars on the minds and hearts of the ancient peoples of Britain. In 874, the kingdom of Mercia was invaded. After this, Halfdan concentrated his activities in the north in the lands of Scotland, while Guthrum was engaged in a struggle in the south with the kingdom of Wessex under the great King Alfred. The years of chaos and turmoil brought change with them. From 875 onwards, Vikings began to settle in certain parts of the island, engaging in agriculture and animal husbandry. Small and large Danish settlements were forming in different geographies of England. Some of them had even settled in Mercia, under Wessex control by reaching an agreement with King Alfred. In 878, Alfred's defeat of the Viking army under Guthrum's command at Edington marked the beginning of a new era. According to the agreement made between the parties, Guthrum was baptized. The barbarian king of the past was now a devout Christian. In addition, the peace he made with Alfred gave him the opportunity to settle freely in the lands of East Anglia. In this way, the foundation of the Viking sphere of influence, which would later be called the Danelaw by historians, was laid. However, this was only a beginning. With another agreement made between Guthrum and Alfred in 886, this sphere of influence was officially recognized by the Anglo-Saxons. Thus, the Vikings finally obtained what they had wanted from the very beginning, a new administrative area in the heart of England, governed by Scandinavian laws. This included the Kingdom of Northumbria in the north and the small kingdom owned by Guthrum in the south. Among the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, only Wessex remained. The invasion of England by the great heathen army was one of the most striking events of the Viking Age. Modern historians estimate that the army that set foot in East Anglia in 865 numbered around 3,000. The army's numbers increased over the years with the participation of newly arrived Scandinavians, and at times decreased due to battles and harsh winter conditions. Furthermore, The Great Heathen Army was one of the most organized armies seen in England up to that time. Although it was mostly composed of Danes, it also included a considerable number of Norwegians and Swedes. Their continuous activity in England from 865 onwards eventually allowed for the formation of an administrative area in the middle of the island, where Scandinavian laws were valid. Moreover, this formation would later enable the great King Canute to establish the North Sea Empire, which encompassed all of England, Denmark, Norway, and a small part of Sweden. Historians and archaeologists today are still researching the extent of the Dane law's influence on England's cultural history. Data from genetic studies make it difficult to reach a clear conclusion due to the shared ancestry of the Anglo-Saxons and Vikings. In contrast, the widespread prevalence of place names of Danish origin in the Danelaw indicates that a significant number of Danes settled in the region. Throughout their age, the Vikings changed the Western world in many ways, and England, of course, was no exception. From across the North Sea, from the land of freezing cold where water and soil were bound by ice, they set out from Scandinavia. Great European cities like Paris, London, York, Rouen, and Dublin were razed by the destruction they brought. The rivers Seine, Thames, Rhine, and Loire carried fear and terror into the heart of France and England. They were given many names in many lands: Viking, Rus, Varangian, Dane, Varangos, Northman. Later, they settled in the northwest of France and merged with the native Gallo-Franks, becoming the Normans. They changed their religion, they assimilated, they turned their axes against their own brothers, and ultimately, within a few centuries, they shaped Europe with their swords by establishing independent kingdoms whose dominions stretched from Britain to the Middle East. After this, their names vanished from the pages of history as if they were never written. But what they did would be remembered forever. On July 20th, 911, the troops of the Frankish king Charles the Simple launched a surprise attack and defeated the Vikings who were besieging Chartres. This was not the first success against the Vikings. The northern raiders had been defeated by Frankish soldiers many times before. But no matter what, they continued to return in larger groups within a few years. However, this was about to change. After the battle on July 20th, the defeated Viking leader Rollo and the Frankish king Charles the Simple met in a small town called Saint-Clair-sur-Epte, near the Epte River, and signed an agreement that would change the course of history. With this agreement, Rollo and his men were officially permitted to settle in the Frankish lands by the king's grace. From now on, Rouen and its surroundings, along with the lands of the Bretons, would be under their administration. But this generous grant came with a price. Rollo and his men would renounce their old Norse religion, become Christians, swear an oath of loyalty to the king, and provide him with military support when needed. Frankly, this offer was quite attractive and reasonable for Rollo, who had been burning and razing the region for years with the aim of settling around the Seine. He was immediately baptized in Rouen along with his son William. As a sign of his loyalty, he married the king's daughter, Gisela. This was followed by other marriages between Vikings and Frankish women. The two factors, becoming Christians and their marriages to the Franks, caused them to assimilate quickly. The fact that mothers were responsible for raising the children ensured they grew up like Franks. Thus, the Viking warriors who sharpened their axes on human flesh were transformed into literate, devout Christians who could hold a pen within a few generations. They looked like Franks, thought like Franks, and spoke the Frankish language. But they were not Franks. The Franks would never see them as one of their own. That is why they gave them the name Normans, which means Northmen in Old French. Soon, every chronicle written in Europe would be filled with the Latinized form of this name, Normanus. When Rollo arrived in Rouen after the agreement, he was met with a ghost city that had been destroyed by the Vikings for years. The people had long abandoned the city. The streets, houses, and churches were empty. Everywhere was in ruins. But this scene would soon change. Rollo's Viking origins enabled him to develop deep relationships with Scandinavia. During this period, some of the Vikings were more interested in trade than plunder. Thus, thanks to his colonization efforts, Rouen quickly became one of Europe's important trade centers. This situation whetted the appetite of not only traders, but also raiding Vikings. Before long, the Seine began to overflow with ships filled with Viking warriors, carrying the destructive power of Scandinavia. The aim of many was to reach Paris by plundering the rich Frankish cities established along the river, especially Rouen. But these adventurous attempts had become much more dangerous than before, because the road to Paris was now protected by Rollo and his men. Charles had achieved his goal. The mouth of the river, where Viking activities were most intense, was now under the control of the Normans. From now on, they would have to slaughter their own brothers, their own kinsmen, to protect their cities. And they didn't need to feel guilty because they were no longer Vikings. They had changed and assimilated. They were Normans. Thus, the agreement made in the town of Saint-Clair-sur-Epte served its purpose by stopping the Viking raids on the heart of Francia at Rouen. But soon, Rollo and his successors, with their primitive emotions sharpened by ambition and passion, would change their policies. Viking raids during this period were more concentrated in England. The deposition of the Frankish king Charles the Simple in 922 shook the Normans' loyalty to the kingdom. It did not take long for Rollo to convince himself that the oath he had sworn to the king was invalid. In this environment, the Normans gradually captured the region up to the Cotentin Peninsula. These lands, stretching from the Seine to Avranches, were now named Normandy, in reference to the Normans. The Normans had quickly adapted to Frankish culture. They abandoned many of their habits during their time in Normandy. In contrast, they continued to carry the northern warrior spirit. They had also not given up their desire to conquer new lands. This desire would eventually carry the history of the Normans far beyond Normandy. In 1066, the death of King Edward of England, without leaving an heir, caused the greatest succession crisis in English history. Soon the north and south of England would turn into a bloodbath for the sake of the ambition and greed of the claimants to the throne. Harold Godwinson, the last Anglo-Saxon king to ascend the English throne on January 6, 1066, was accused of usurping the throne by William, Duke of Normandy, and Harald Hardrada, King of Norway. The first to put his reaction into action was Harald Hardrada. He left Scandinavia with a fleet of about 300 ships and landed in the north of England. His biggest supporter was King Godwinson's brother, Tostig. In the Battle of Fulford on September 20th, the English troops led by Edwin, Earl of Mercia, and his brother Morcar were heavily defeated by the Vikings. But this victory was not enough for the Norwegian king to seize the throne. 5 days later, on September 25th, in another battle that took place at Stamford Bridge, the Anglo-Saxons, led by Harold Godwinson, massacred the Vikings. When the fighting ended and the blood was absorbed by the earth, the scene on the battlefield became clearer. Among the thousands of Vikings lay the lifeless bodies of Hardrada and Tostig. Harold Godwinson had won a decisive victory against the relentless warriors of the north. This battle brought an end to the Viking Age, which had left its mark on medieval Europe. England was saved. But if he wanted to protect his crown, he had to do more. For just 3 days after the bloody battle at Stamford Bridge, he received the news that William, Duke of Normandy, had landed at Pevensey. One invasion attempt had just ended, while another had begun. William's army consisted not only of Normans, but also of Franks gathered from various parts of France. If Harold did not want to lose his crown, he had to respond to this threat quickly. Therefore, he immediately marched towards the south of England. Finally, in the Battle of Hastings on October 14, 1066, the Anglo-Saxons of England suffered a heavy defeat against the French Normans. The last Anglo-Saxon king, Harold Godwinson, lay lifeless on the battlefield. William had won. He was the conqueror of England. After conquering England, William became both Duke of Normandy and King of England, ushering in a new era of transformation. Normans crossed the Channel in waves, and Anglo-Saxon institutions quickly vanished. Although the old shire system remained, governance became distinctly Norman. Society was reorganized, and land ownership meticulously recorded in the Domesday Book. The greatest change was linguistic. Peasants spoke Old English, while the royal court adopted Norman French. Over time, the two blended into what became modern English. Under William's successors, Norman power expanded into Wales, Ireland, and Scotland. By Henry II's reign, their realm stretched from Scotland to the Pyrenees, vast compared to the diminished holdings of the French king. The Normans also reshaped Europe's map. Drawn southward by Mediterranean ambition, Norman adventurers like the Hauteville brothers, William and Robert Guiscard, transformed southern Italy and Sicily into a formidable kingdom. By 1130, under Roger II, the Norman realm had become a dominant Mediterranean power. Their legacy was not merely conquest, it was the complete remaking of England and a bold new chapter in European history. The structure the Normans inherited here was multicultural. Their respect for the continuity of the cultures that had lived in the region for centuries soon turned the kingdom into one of the Mediterranean's centers of tolerance. Arabic, Greek, Latin, and Norman French were used as official languages. Muslim poets and intellectuals, as well as Byzantine artists and architects, could easily find a place for themselves in the court of Roger II. The Normans saw this place as a land of opportunity when they came to southern Italy. And when they built their own kingdom, they continued to keep alive this attractive aspect of the lands they owned. In addition, the Normans were at the center of the Crusades. A Crusader county was established in Antioch by Bohemond, the son of the southern Italian Norman Robert Guiscard, and thanks to him, the Norman presence had the opportunity to spread to the Middle East. However, by the 13th century, the name Norman began to slowly fade from the stage of history. Their most striking feature was their ability to quickly adapt to the society they entered. For this reason, after a while, they dissolved among the various peoples of Europe. But the influence they left behind was much more long-lived than their political entities. Modern historical interpretation also leans towards a similar view. But whatever the reason, England was now on the brink of an invasion, and the first to realize this were the local people living in the lands of East Anglia. Towards the end of 865, the great heathen army had settled in the town of Thetford, part of this kingdom in the southeast of England. The inhabitants of East Anglia, who had suffered numerous Viking attacks before, lacked the energy to fight such a large military force. Instead, they decided it would be wise to make a deal that would be attractive to the other side. In addition to paying the annual land tax, the Danegeld, they agreed to provide horses for the Vikings to conquer distant parts of England.